Uruguay, ranked 14th in the world by FIFA, are one of the most historic World Cup teams to ever represent their nation on the world stage. This year's finals in Qatar will be the 14th time they've qualified for the tournament, having hosted the very first ever official World Cup held by FIFA. They are twice champions, including the inaugural tournament, although it's been 72 years since they repeated the feat. Uruguay in 1930 was the first time FIFA differentiated itself from the Olympics to decide who was the world's greatest footballing nation. Although rife with political controversy, La Celeste didn't mind dominating the tournament with wins in the semi-final over Yugoslavia and a win in the final over Argentina to lift the very first World Cup. Political bickering on par with the British not participating in pre-war tournaments would preclude the Uruguayans from traveling to Europe for the 1934 or 1938 tournaments, just the same as some European nations refused to come to Uruguay in 1930. Many of the same issues plagued the 1950 tournament in Brazil, with some of the European nations still recovering from the war. Not weighted down by these same issues, the Sky Blue could only play what was in front of them, and it happened to be a Bolivian side that didn't have much teeth in the only first-round group game of the group. This was due to the withdrawal of Scotland and Turkey from the tournament. The format was such that the tournament was decided round-robin style, but there would be a final for all intents and purposes. Results in the first two matches meant Brazil only had to beat Uruguay to become world champions on home soil. However, Alcides Guilla scored his fourth in as many games to lead the Uruguayans to their second world championship for the host nation. The tournament in Switzerland still had an interesting format at the time, and the South American holders only had to play 2 games in group stage, where they dominated the Czechs and the Scots by an aggregate of 9-0. This was plenty to see them into the quarterfinals, where they faced England. An impressive 4-2 win in Basel saw them into the semifinal, where it took 2 late goals to send it to extra time. The Hungarians seemed to have more in the tank as they sunk Sky Blue hearts with 2 late goals in extra time to see off the reigning champions. The third place match was coincidentally played against the other group stage team they had yet to play, Austria. Uruguay seemed to have run out of steam by this match, and they would finish the tournament 4th with a 3-1 loss to the Austrians. The World Cup was held in Chile in 1962, and it seemed like the Uruguayans were in a state of flux, a transition period, if you will. More nations from the Eastern Bloc in Europe traveled to this one, and the Sky Blue were in a group with the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, both of whom would prove too much for La Celeste, and despite an opening match win over South American rivals Colombia, this would be the first tournament that Uruguay failed to qualify for the later stages of the Cup. The glory days of yesteryear seemed far behind them. It felt like the Malays in the Chilean edition followed Uruguay across the pond to England for 1966. They would face the hosts in the very first match of the tournament. A drab 0-0 at Wembley in front of 87,000 people was certainly not what either set of fans was hoping for. A 2-1 win against a disappointing French side would represent the only goals scored by the South American squad during this tournament, although a 0-0 with Mexico was enough to see them into the quarterfinal. The West German power was rising behind a certain Franz Beckenbauer, and they blanked the Uruguayans in their match held in Sheffield 4-0. La Celeste would be back to their normal competitive self down in Mexico, opening against surprise qualifier Israel, who would be appearing in their only World Cup finals in the nation's history. The South American side triumphed 2-0. A draw with perennials Italy, followed by a tough loss to a 90th minute goal against Sweden, was still enough to see them over the line and into the quarterfinals. It took extra time at the Azteca Stadium to beat the Soviets, but the Uruguayans once again found themselves in the semifinal against a familiar foe. Seriously, who hasn't lost a soul-crusher to Brazil in the World Cup? Despite taking the lead in the 19th minute, the Celeste were too much for the Sky Blues, coming back to win 3-1, sending Uruguay once again to the third-place match, against another opponent they weren't overly fond of. West Germany pipped them for the bronze by only 1-0. There must have been something in the air in Germany, and indeed any time the Uruguayans even thought about the West Germans, because despite not playing the host themselves, the tournament in West Germany would only be the second time the Uruguayan Giants failed to make it out of group. Of course, the might of Johan Cruyff and the Dutch were first up, so that didn't help, and then the surprising Bulgarians forced a 1-1 draw before the Swedes ran them off the pitch in Dusseldorf 3-0 for a disappointing exit in 1974. The loss to Sweden would haunt La Celeste for 14 long years, representing their longest hiatus from this most prestigious tournament. But they were back in Mexico in 1986, and of course, who else would they open the tournament against? West Germany would scrape a point with an 84th minute equalizer before the Danish absolutely ran roughshod over Uruguay 6-1 in the second match. A 0-0 draw with Scotland saw Uruguay advance as one of the best third-place teams as per the format that year, but they would be against none other than Maradona and the Argentine machine that would not be denied in this tournament. I think we all know where this is going. Their talisman didn't net in this one, but Argentina still triumphed 1-0, sending Uruguay out in the round of 16. 4 years later would require another trip across the pond to European lands. The format was much the same, and the results nearly mirrored that of the previous ones as well. 0-0 with Spain before crumbling to the Belgians, who scored 3 goals before Uruguay could answer late. It just wasn't enough. This left them in a literal playoff with the South Koreans for a third-place spot to advance as one of the best third-place teams. It took a 90th minute goal to see them through to face the hosts. Playing Italy in Rome can't be fun at any time in history, I would imagine, and this one was no different. Despite pulling the Azzurri at bay for 65 minutes, they would lose 2-0 and head home once again from the round of 16. Another 2-cup absence from the World Cup followed Italy 1990, but Uruguay would be drawn into arguably the most interesting group of the Far East edition of the tournament in Korea and Japan. Danes once again caused South American heartbreak in the opener, leaving the winner late on in a 2-1 match. Surprise stinkers of this tournament, France held the Sky Blue to a 0-0, and then the even bigger surprise of the tournament, Senegal raced to a 3-0 halftime lead over the Uruguayans. I can only imagine what was said in that dressing room, but whatever it was galvanized La Celeste, and they came out firing. Diego Forlan announced himself with a stunning strike in this one, but it took an 88th minute penalty to complete the comeback and draw level in a tantalizing 3-3 finish that would still leave the Uruguayan giant on the plane home for only the third time in the nation's history to not advance from the group stage. After missing out on qualification for Germany, the Sky Blues will return to the world stage in South Africa. This is honestly the first tournament where I took notice of what La Celeste could do. It was also a tournament marked by ridiculous Diego Forlan strikes and goal line drama from Luis Suarez. A drab 0-0 with France would be followed by an exciting prospect versus the hosts, who were flying and had incredible support. Forlan and co. were too much for them, however, and cruised to a 3-0 victory. A 1-0 win over Mexico in Rustenburg would see them winners of the group and through to face South Korea. Suarez would bag 2 goals and La Celeste would move on to the quarters against Ghana for one of the most infamous moments in World Cup history. Diego Forlan cancelled out a supplementary goal to send this one to overtime at 1-1. Some have dubbed this incident the second hand of God, wherein Suarez would make an excellent one-handed save on the line in the dying minutes of overtime. No, he wasn't filling in for the goalkeeper, he simply was willing to pay the price to keep the ball out of the net. It was a long hope, but a penalty kick opportunity was preferable to a certain goal. The referee followed the laws of the game, and Suarez was shown the red, and the spot kick was awarded. Despite how dirty this feels, the letter of the law was adhered to across the board. It's understandable that Ghanaians still feel cheated, but one can only imagine the euphoria and surprise that Luis Suarez felt as seeing the resultant shot smash the crossbar and his keeper slapping the woodwork in appreciation and joy. This was the last kick of the ball, and the Sky Blues went on to win the shootout. It would see them face the Dutch in the semi-final in what is arguably one of the best semi-finals I've ever seen in World Cup history. A 3-2 heart crusher, including a Gio van Bronckhorst ice beam that's still one of the greatest goals ever scored in World Cup history. Not to be outdone, Forlan scored a screamer to equalize just before halftime. The Orangemen would come out the better side in the second half, and their dominance would prove too much. relegating Uruguay to another third-place match, which was an incredible game as well, 3-2 to the Germans, meaning La Celeste finished fourth once again. 4 years on from what was arguably the most dramatic run Uruguay ever had at a World Cup where they didn't win, they would find themselves in another spicy group with a team that had their own quite dramatic run down in Brazil. Costa Rica announced their intent at this cup with a monster win over La Celeste in the opening match, 3-1. Luis Suarez helped Uruguay bounce back to beat England before they faced the Italians in the third game in what was essentially a playoff for qualification into the next round. An 81st minute winner from Godin would see them through to face the Colombians in the round of 16. There, James Rodriguez would prove just too much, and it would be his 2 goals that spelled Uruguayan doom and crashed them out of the tournament. Drawn into the host group in 2018, the Uruguayans handled business versus Egypt and Saudi Arabia before dampening the hosts' spirited run 3-0 in the third match. This left them facing Ronaldo and the Portuguese, whom they were able to corral and defeat with a couple of Edinson Cavani goals. It was the quarterfinals again for the Sky Blue, but no one could stop the French juggernaut last time out, with Raphael Varane and Antoine Griezmann sealing Uruguayan fates for a long trip home. This historic and storied nation at the World Cup will face a mean South Korea squad, Ronaldo at his last tournament, and a Ghana side with only one thing on their mind: revenge. Presumably we will see Suarez and Cavani in their 4th tournament, as well as Diego Godin and Muslera, all named to the provisional squad at the time of this recording. The later 2 already have the most appearances at the finals, and the former have the most goals, excepting Oscar Miguez, champion of 1950, and main man in 1954. Edinson Cavani can surpass all of these records and become the man with the most appearances and the most goals in La Celeste history. All 4 of them can match Pedro Roca's record of the only Uruguayan to appear in 4 cups this time around. History tells us that the Uruguayans will at least progress to the knockout stages, but can this giant of a World Cup nation hit the heights of the earliest memories of the tournament and bring the trophy back to the place it was first held and won? We'll find out in just a few days' time.